The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. During his 2004 inauguration speech, President George Bush outlined a foreign policy strategy now known as the Bush Doctrine. It called for strong offensive moves against weapons of mass destruction and global terrorism. Today we discuss the effectiveness of the Bush Doctrine with Francis Fukuyama, author of America at the Crossroads, Democracy, Power, and the Neoconservative Legacy. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Francis Fukuyama, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
Really delighted to have you here. Let's spend some time talking about your most recent book, America at the Crossroads. I'll hold it up for the camera. Democracy, Power, and the Neoconservative Legacy. This book is relatively critical of the Bush foreign policy. And let me just read one sentence from it and then ask you to explain what you have in mind. The so-called Bush Doctrine that set the framework for the administration's first term is now in shambles. And so is the idealistic effort to use American power to promote democracy and human rights abroad, which may be its greatest setback. Why is it in shambles? What do you mean by shambles?
Well, there are a lot of dimensions, I think, in which we're at a crisis in America's relations with the rest of the world. The Bush Doctrine was actually a very coherent set of ideas that had to do with preventive war to stop nuclear proliferation, war against terrorism, a certain attitude towards international cooperation that, if you want to be non-pejorative about it, you would say it emphasized American leadership and ex post legitimation by the international community, and the use of democracy. And I think in every single one of those dimensions, we've suffered big setbacks. I think Iran and North Korea accelerated their nuclear programs rather than slowing them down. Iraq has become a tar baby that everyone is quite familiar, with the problems there. And they're not going to be over even if we withdraw in the next, or perhaps especially if we withdraw in the near future. And I think the prospects of democracy and the idea of democratic institutions around the world has received a big setback because of its close association with a very unpopular American foreign policy. So,
you made so many points just then, and it reminded me how long ago 2004 seems, and the president's inaugural address in 2005, where he, in effect, laid out the major elements of the Bush Doctrine and democracy. And this was an attempt, right, to use American power to bring democracy to various parts of the world?
Well, it was an attempt to use American power, I think, to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. And so retrospectively, I think the democracy justification became more important as the weapons did not appear and as the terrorist connection seemed more fragile. But it certainly was an assertion of American power, not just to fix one narrow problem, but really to try to transform the politics of an entire region and to get at what were regarded as the deep roots of terrorism after September 11th.
So are you saying that if we had found weapons of mass destruction, the president might not have announced a pro-democracy Bush Doctrine?
Well, he had announced the democracy component before the war, but it was the third of three justifications after the WMD and after terrorism, and it became more important as the first two fell away. But certainly, I think the whole policy would have looked a lot better if they had found a nuclear program or large stocks of biological weapons.
Now, there's some loose talk about the administration lied or whatever. How do you describe the mistakes that were made about weapons of mass destruction?
It depends on which weapon. I think everybody was fooled about the chemical and biological weapons. I think, French and Russian intelligence services probably believed that we'd find something.
Sort of the Iraqi army.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the commanders thought that they were in the next unit over. And the the evidence for the nuclear program was a lot thinner. I know that there's a theory out there that says that this was all a deliberate lie. Knowing very well a lot of the people in the administration, I absolutely know that they believed, with all their hearts that even if they couldn't get the right information about the yellow cake in Niger and so forth, that basically there was a program there. The line...
They expected to be proven right. So
yes.
They glossed over the sufficiency of the evidence.
That's right, yeah. So I think in their hearts they thought they'd be right. The part that I think was deliberately false and known to be false was the association of Iraq with September 11th and the links with Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, which I think was one of the reasons that President Bush got reelected in 2004, because, and then you get the statistic that something like 60% of the American soldiers serving in Iraq think that they're avenging September 11th in some sense. And that, I think, they probably knew a lot better, but they thought that politically this was a good way to justify the war.
They never quite said it, right? It was just very careful parsing of the language. So if you went back and read it on a cold piece of paper, I think you wouldn't say, well, there they are saying it's Al-Qaeda and Iraq.
Well, in fact, President Bush said there wasn't a connection, but then you get the Republican convention where you get the Twin Towers and then a shift to Iraq, and it's all, merged as a single global conflict.
You've also written that in their thinking about Iraq and their decision to go in, they conflated concerns about radical Islam and the dysfunction of the Middle East. What did you mean by that?
There was an analysis, again, fairly coherent, that said that the basic cause of terrorism was not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was not American bases, that it was the deep lack of democracy and political space in the Middle East, and that therefore if you could show that you could create an Arab regime that could sustain a modern democracy, it would have a transformative effect on the politics of that region. There is something to that. It's not a ridiculous idea because politics, particularly in the Arab Middle East, has been authoritarian, has not permitted any kind of pluralism over the past generation, and it does create real tensions. But the problem, I think, is that that's actually not the cause of terrorism. I think just the fact that so many of the terrorists have actually been radicalized in nice democratic Western Europe in places like Amsterdam or Paris or London indicates that it's really not a lack of familiarity with democracy that motivates people to turn to this kind of radicalism.
I think you've described it as something about those Arabs and other people in Europe being outside of the control of their communities and the networks, and that encouraged the movement. Is that right?
Well, I think that you can understand it in terms of modern identity politics, that if you're actually religious in a traditional sense, your identity is fixed. You know who you are, you know what the rules are, your local imam and your family sets all of that for you. What's interesting, though, is so many of the people who are radicalized are not people that grew up in traditional peasant communities somewhere in the backwaters of Morocco or
they're engineers.
They're engineers and they're people that have been exposed to the modern world. And I think it's a classic case where your parents move to Marseille, you grow up in a French banlieue, and you don't feel French after the second generation, or in London or other places, and that's really what I think causes this disjunction between who you wish you were and who you actually are. And that, this is not, we've seen this before in many of the accounts of the radicalism in Bolshevism or in fascism. You get the same kind of transition, this rapid transition from a traditional society that psychologically, I think, is at the root of the radicalization.
Well, I think you've written that pre-Iraq there maybe were a few thousand people like that, but I think you feel now there are many more, Now not just in Europe, who have been radicalized and are ready to do bad things to the West.
Yes, although I do think that the administration has overstated the degree of the global terrorist threat because of this connection with weapons of mass destruction. I mean, this is the thing that makes it so difficult to think clearly about this problem. Weapons of mass destruction, the idea of a nuclear weapon going off in New York City raises the stakes of even a very, very low probability act so high that it justifies all sorts of things that you would never think of doing, like torturing people or preemptively invading countries, if all you're worried about is car bombs and the more typical kind of terrorism. And it is extremely difficult as a public policy problem to correctly evaluate what those risks really are. But it matters whether it's a 1 in 100,000 risk or a 1 in 10 risk, and you'll do certain things, to put off the first or the latter that you wouldn't in the first case.
How do you react when people say, well, the Bush team wanted to go into Iraq from day one, and all of this weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, whether they believed it or not, that was just the reason they gave for a more fundamental desire to depose Saddam Hussein?
I think that's probably right. I think you could have justified the invasion in terms of non-proliferation policy, that you had to stop this guy, otherwise the whole non-proliferation regime would crumble. I don't believe that using preventive war to do that was a good policy, but it was certainly a serious argument. And I do think that September 11th then created a political base for doing that among the American public that you simply didn't have before that attack.
Now, you mentioned in our opening that we went in hoping for a subsequent and ex post facto legitimation. What did you mean by that?
American leadership throughout the Cold War basically means we move first and then we get all our European allies to applaud when we do something successful. And again, to be fair to the Bush administration, there is a history of that. The most recent one was really in the Balkans in the 1990s, when the Europeans faced this problem in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, and they could not solve it on their own. They just could not solve it. And it took, in the case of the Dayton Accords, an American diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, and in the case of Kosovo, an American general leading a NATO coalition to really punch through this collective action problem. And so I think Americans are used to thinking that if they don't lead, no one else is going to follow. And so that's why when Wes Clark came back to the Pentagon when Rumsfeld had become Secretary of Defense, someone told him, Wes, we read your book about Kosovo. We'll never let that happen again. We'll never be hobbled by these Lilliputians. We're just going to act and ask questions later. And I think the basic problem with that is that it simply misunderstands a basic feature of our world today, which is a kind of structural and inescapable anti-Americanism, which is a simple...
Why structural?
Well, it's structural because, there's...
Besides the fact that no one likes the person who lives in the biggest house on the block.
Well, that's a good definition. I don't know if that'll work in a public policy school as a definition of structural.
Would you give me a passing grade if that's how I wrote it?
Yeah, well, it works just as well. That's the problem, is that you've got this disproportion of power, which means that the United States can affect other countries on all sorts of dimensions of power: economic, cultural, political. We could overturn regimes 8,000 miles away without breaking a sweat, and they can't do anything back to us. And so I just think that that kind of apparent hegemony creates a lot of resentment, because people feel that they don't have a real voice in the way that American leaders act. And so I think that the administration going into the war simply did not realize the degree to which they were swimming against this very deep current, and that they would not get the ex post applause that they thought they would.
Well, they actually worked at preventing it. I remember that after when things still looked relatively good, and there was this issue about whether French and German contractors should be allowed in. Boy, I bet they rue that decision. They said, no, these are our spoils, right? Only Americans are in there.
That's right. Well, there's structural anti-Americanism, and then there's well-deserved anti-Americanism because you're behaving like stupidly. And there's a lot of that in the first year of the administration, just this casual contempt for a whole series of multilateral agreements and institutions, withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, which was actually, I think, not politically at all necessary, and ABM treaty, landmines, a whole series of actions that seemed to indicate to non-Americans that the United States simply was not going to be bound by anything.
It seemed almost in your face. Why was that?
This is the Jacksonian, what Walter Mead calls the Jacksonian strand in American politics, very pugnacious, very highly defensive of sovereignty, not wanting commitments or constraints on American freedom of action. And if you're very powerful, you can usually get away with something like that.
I searched in your book for the word hubris, and I didn't see the word, but I got the impression repeatedly. Is that right?
Yes. This was a difficult book for me to write because I was writing about decisions that were taken by people who were friends of mine and I'd known a long time, and it seemed to me that the less you personalize the analysis, or at least for me, the better it would be. I mean, I do think that there are enormous, that hubris is the only word that you can use to describe the failure to plan for the reconstruction and the aftermath of the invasion. It was based on a whole set of extremely optimistic assumptions about how the world worked. It would have been one thing to say, well, we actually thought that things could go wrong, but we just guessed wrong. But the absolute certainty with which people went into this, I think, was really quite hubristic.
We also didn't. We went in, I think, some part of the government at least, thinking it was going to appoint someone to run the country and leave. And then the government seems to have changed its mind and decided someplace along the lines that they were going to rebuild the entire country, and went into a fairly intensive process of state building, first by destroying whatever remnants of the state were there. Do I have that right?
Yes. The first option wouldn't have worked because there was no one to appoint. Certainly none of the external actors had anything like the legitimacy to actually run the country, nor the capacity. I think this is one of the issues where I run an international development program at my school, and I worry a lot about institutions, and this is the one incomprehensible part of it, because a modern society is not a default condition that people somehow come to overnight. It's a matter of painfully created institutions that have to be put there one by one, and I think there was just a big conceptual failure to recognize the requirements for what it takes to create a democratic and market-oriented society.
Now, as we talk here, everyone assumes that we'll be leaving Iraq, if not precipitously, then in short order. Where does that leave American foreign policy for the next decade?
Well, the honest answer is no one knows. You can spin off a lot of really unpleasant scenarios about intensifying civil war that draws in the regional powers and leads to a much larger cataclysm, spreading terrorism and so forth. My own personal suspicion is that overstates the problem, that the regional powers know better than to get drawn into something like this, and so you could have a fairly benign, not benign for the Iraqis, but benign in international terms, where the civil war intensifies and then they get tired of fighting, as usually happens in civil wars, and then they finally come to the kind of power sharing arrangement that they can't achieve now. And as in the case of Vietnam, after we pulled out, it would turn out that the consequences of this are not nearly as grave for American interests as they seemed. I would bet on the latter one, but I would be the first to say the first scenario is entirely possible.
And how about our place in the world? I mean, you said a moment ago that all of this aggravated the structural antipathy to things American. Where does that put us in terms of our world leadership, and does it matter?
I think it matters a lot because I really think that the way that in the end we get influence in our way around the world is much more by our example and the moral capital that we've accumulated, and we've simply blown a lot of that, and it's going to take quite a while to recover it. Now, it's an intangible thing, and because we are very powerful, people are going to keep coming to us and wanting to work with us. But there's this other dimension of power that I think is also quite critical, and it's also critical for the spread of democratic market institutions in other parts of the world, as whether the countries that espouse these values look like, if they look like they're being hypocritical, it's much harder to convince people that that's the right way to go. So I do think it matters in the long run.
As an observer, it seemed to me that the deterioration of our ability to negotiate trade agreements to further fair and balanced globalization has been a victim of this as well. It seems as if we don't have the moral authority on that issue either.
Yeah, on trade, I'm not sure it's so much a matter of moral authority as maintaining the domestic consensus in this country in favor of trade liberalization, and that consensus has clearly been deteriorating over the last 10, 15 years.
Now, before we close and turn to questions from the audience, in your book you do talk about an alternative approach to foreign policy. And I think you call it realistic Wilsonianism. I've practiced making sure I could say that. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, there are several traditional schools of foreign policy. The realists, like Henry Kissinger, want to take a narrow view of American interests that does not include things like human rights in other countries or democracy promotion. There's a Jacksonian school, which is much more pugnacious. This is named after Andrew Jackson, which is much more nationalist and has an even narrower view of American interests. And so those are going to come back into play because of the failure of this fourth school, this neoconservative school that was both ambitious and wanted to use power in this very bold way.
And that thought it had been proven right with the fall of Russia, Soviet Russia, and the easy responses other places.
And I do not want American foreign policy to retreat into either a traditional form of isolationism or one of these other. I do think that we have to be more restrictive in our sense of what we can do, and so that's the realistic part of Wilsonianism. I think that for the most part, hard power actually does not get you very far in many, particularly in the Middle East and that part of the world. So we need other types of influence promotion. But we also need to stay engaged because we benefit tremendously from globalization and from our shaping of international institutions. And I think it would be too bad if, as a result of this big foreign policy failure, all of that got reversed in terms of what the American people would support.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for such an informative discussion. Before we turn to our audience for questions, let me also say to those in the viewing audience, we hope that you will send us your comments and questions. You can write to us at policywatch@umd.edu. And now, as I said, let's turn to our audience for questions.
Hi, my name is Ryan Lewis. I'm an incoming policy student here at Maryland, and on behalf of all incoming students, thank you for speaking with us tonight. My question regards, in the news media, there's been, I guess, more and more articles appearing about the upcoming report from General Petraeus, and most of these articles are regarding that his report is kind of a little bit too late. Let's say that his report was to come back positive, that we are gaining at least some ground in terms of the troop surge. Is it possible that that surge could be providing security in terms of allowing civil society to perhaps grow, and that maybe cutting out of Iraq might not be the best strategy at this time if that report were to come back positive? In other words, meaning that, let's say that I don't think his report is a little bit too late, is perhaps what media outlets are saying at this time.
I think that there's a deeper question that you got to look at in terms of how we are going to get an exit strategy out of Iraq. Whatever the surge does, it may lower violence, it may kill a certain number of insurgents, and I actually suspect that that side of it is going to be pretty positive. But you cannot get to anything that looks like victory in Iraq unless you have a cohesive government that seems to be legitimate, with a military that can stand on its own in the absence of a large American troop presence. And those are the two things that I think they've made zero progress towards. And so then we're faced with this problem. We can't win and we can't lose. We could stay as long as we're willing to pay the price in terms of resources and lives lost. And how long are we going to do that? And I suspect that the answer is probably not that long.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you for being at the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.